It is now my pleasure to introduce to you my colleague, Professor Dr. Erik Buyst, who is the director of VIVES at Catholic University of Louvain. He's there a professor at the Department of Economics, presently chairman, and he's a former senior economist at the Department of Economics and Statistics of Kredietbank, now KBC. His research interests are economic history, business history, history of European integration, and history of economic thought. As director of VIVES, which is the Research Center for Regional Policy, he has a mission to conduct fundamental and applied research on regional economy and politics in order to contribute to the public debate on the economic and social development of regions, especially of Flanders. The research topics of VIVES are organized around four main themes, being fiscal federalism, regional labor markets, regional and European integration en industrial policy. Waarde collega, uw team van professoren en onderzoekers dragen op zeer regelmatige wijze bij tot het rationaliseren en het materialiseren van het debat rond fiscale autonomie voor Vlaanderen en rond efficiënte solidariteitsmechanismes. Het is ook daarover dat u vandaag zal spreken. Het is daarover dat uw medewerkers enkele maanden geleden 2 mooie bijdragen leverden voor ons boek. Dear colleague, dear Professor Buyst, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, Excellencies, good afternoon, or I should say good evening, because it's getting late. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation, and it's always nice to jump from Europe to small little Belgium. But as you will notice, also Belgium can be very exciting. Where am I going to talk about? Well, first of all, we are going to define interregional transfers. What is it exactly? Secondly, we'll take a look at the root of the problem. Where do they come from? Then we will say a word about policy responses. We will analyze the efficiency of the whole thing. We will take a glimpse at the Belgian state reforms, and then there will be a conclusion. First of all, definition. What are interregional transfers? First of all, we only talk about public transfers. So in other words, we are not talking about private financial flows. So in other words, they have to go in a certain form through the government. And the government is defined here in a very broad way. So not only including the federal government, but also the social security system, also the regions and communities, and so on and so forth. And for every geographical entity, if we want to calculate the interregional transfers, we have to do 3 things. First of all, we have to look at the revenues, and then we, of course, look to the revenues from taxes, from social security contributions to finance common public expenditures, so expenditures that flow to the whole society, if you like. That's one element you have to do. Second element, you have to look at the spending flows. Where does the money go to that is taxed, that we get from revenues? And finally, we have the difference between those 2 items, which provides us the interregional transfers. If we have the interregional transfers, then of course the big discussion is who is the net contributor and who is the net receiver. If we look at the roots of the problem, then we see immediately that for a long time Flanders has been the net contributor to the system, and this is certainly true from the mid-1960s until today. So in other words, this is already a process that is taking on for almost half a century now. But, and that's an important but, it only became something serious in the mid-1970s and especially in the early 1980s, because then we see that the figures, the amount of the net transfers really increased dramatically. And this brings me to the question, how do we explain that evolution? Well, of course, everybody knows the story of the collapse of the Walloon state, of the Walloon coal mines, and that, of course, is an important reason why things went wrong in Belgium. But there's another element to it, because the collapse of coal mining in Belgium, because of the breakthrough of oil in the 1950s, especially in the 1960s, also benefited Flanders enormously. Flanders benefited from the breakthrough of oil because we got the oil refineries, we got the petrochemical industries in the 1960s, we got the oil-related industries such as car assembly and so on. And then we have a second step. The second step is the well-known oil crisis of the 1970s, 1973, 74, 1979, 1980, 1979 and 1980. Then we see the oil shocks. Oil becomes much more expensive, and we see that a region that is heavily dependent on energy-intensive industries, like Wallonia at the time, suffers disproportionately. So some people say, well, this is only a game of an asymmetric shock. Wallonia is just having bad luck. Energy-intensive industries are located there, so it's normally that they suffer more than the average in Belgium. But then we have Paul de Grauwe, a good friend from Professor Zinn, and he, in his younger years, in 1980, did a study. And this was a very influential study because he investigated the problems of Wallonia more in depth. And what does it mean? Well, he says it's not just an element of bad luck, there is more at hand. And he calculated that unit labor costs in Wallonia, so in other words, the wage cost corrected for labor productivity changes, that they were 10% higher in Flanders than in Wallonia. And of course, this has serious disadvantages for the Walloon economy in the sense that it becomes very unattractive for foreign investments, also for domestic investments. And that also means that the restructuring of the Walloon economy did not make much progress in the 1960s and the 1970s. And also the domestic firms, they focus more on labor-saving technologies than on anything else. So in other words, the creation of employment was very limited in Wallonia in those years. And Paul de Grauwe also says, well, that wage cost problem is one of the drivers of the famous interregional transfers that we have in this country. He doesn't develop the idea very much, but of course, the fact that he shows that it's not only bad luck, but that there is also something wrong with the wage formation in Wallonia is an important element to put questions after the legitimacy of the transfers in Flanders. Next question is, of course, why does Wallonia have a wage problem in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and even until today? Well, the origins come from the coal mining industry. As you all know, coal mining is a very dangerous job, is a very heavy job, is a very unhealthy job. So you have to offer high wages to get people into the mines. But the problem is that in the mine areas, we see that all sectors have to pay high wages, even in the food processing industries. In the textile industries in those regions, all those wages are pushed up. We call that the demonstration effect. So in other words, the high wages in the coal mines push up the wages everywhere else in the region. And then you would expect, well, if the mines disappear, then there are no miners anymore. And then, of course, the demonstration effect stops. Yes, but what do we see? Well, there's a lot of stickiness. There is a lot of rigidity, especially downward rigidity. And the result is that high wages prevail in the Walloon areas. It's not only an element of sticky wages, of downward rigidity, also government policy plays a role. And what government policies do we see in the late 1950s and afterwards? Well, there is a lot of private sector unemployment popping up, but this is repressed, if you like, by creation of employment in the public sector, but also by early retirement already in the late 1950s, but then only in the mining sector. So in other words, the unemployment problem that should have arisen because of the troubles is suppressed by government action. And this, of course, gives no incentives at all to correct the unit wage problem. What are the other policy responses? Well, the other policy responses are as follows. We have a sharp increase in unemployment in the mid-1970s because of the oil shock we already explained. But remarkably enough, it does not generate wage moderation. And then, of course, the question is, why is that so? Well, we all know that Belgium has a very particular bargaining system. So we have national wage agreements. So in other words, if something is wrong on the regional level, it is not easily corrected because of those national wage agreements. Everything goes up or down in the same quantity, if you like. And in Belgium, it always goes up. So it's a one-way street. Secondly, you have generous unemployment benefits, unlimited in time. So in other words, there is not much incentive to do something about the problem. And finally, there is also the Walloon public opinion in the 1970s and the 1980s who blames the Walloon economic problem somewhere else. They say it's not a problem of wages. No, it's not a problem of whatever. It's a problem of entrepreneurial failure. The holding companies, the Société Générale, is letting us down. So in other words, we do not believe very much anymore in the private sector. We want something else. We want public initiative, but the Belgian government is reluctant to do so. So in other words, we want economic autonomy. We forget that, but demand for economic autonomy is not coming from Flanders in the 1960s and 1970s, but it's coming from Wallonia, because they want a different economic structure. They want another experiment. Then in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, we have in Belgium a general problem of wage competitiveness. And everybody knows the story. In 1982, we devalue the Belgian franc. We impose wage moderation. So in other words, we try to correct the mess that we are in the beginning of the 1980s. But, and that's very strange, it does nothing to change the regional wage gap. So in other words, nothing changes. And I have a graph, and there you see the wage share. So in other words, is another way of expressing the unit wage problem, unit wage cost problem. The red line is Wallonia, the blue line is Flanders, by coincidence. So in other words, what do we see? In 1980, when Paul de Grauwe was doing his study, we see indeed a wage gap of approximately 10%. Then we have the moderation policies, and what do we see? Both wage series just decline in about the same order. So what the gap is concerned, nothing changes, okay? Next step, because the Walloon wage costs remain disproportionately high, we see that Wallonia misses the general international economic recovery of the second half of the 1980s. So in other words, where Flanders booms in the second half of the 1980s, not much is happening in Wallonia. And of course, this produces a continuing unemployment problem. I will come back to that in a minute. Flanders, on the other hand, because of the booming economy, is facing shortages in certain segments of the labor market. And in other words, we see a catching up of the two regions, but in the wrong direction. So in other words, it are not the Walloon wages that are going down, or the wage share of Wallonia that is going down. No, it are the Flemish wages that are going up. But you see that there remains a differential at the detriment of Wallonia. So Walloon wage costs remain higher than Flemish wage costs, which is very strange for a region which is already in severe difficulties for 25 years in a row by then. Next step, unemployment rate. Again, the red line is the unemployment rate for Wallonia. Blue one is for Flanders, and you see in the beginning of the 1980s, those unemployment rates are pretty much the same. What do we see? Well, after the mid-1980s, a serious divergence of those two graphs. The red line, Wallonia, is going up all the time with a few business cycle fluctuations. In Flanders, there is a kind of downward trend, and you really see the difference in the late 1980s, the effect of the boom in Flanders and the relative stagnation in Wallonia. It has serious effects on the unemployment rate. This brings me to the following question. Why do we have to think in such a framework about the efficiency of interregional transfers? Well, if we only look at the empirical side and we say, well, if the gap between Flanders and Wallonia is so stubborn in the long run, well, then there is something wrong. In other words, transfers don't help very much, okay? But of course, this is only one observation, and we want more evidence. And if we want more evidence, then we turn to economic theory. And I've put a few authors down the slide, and they come to the following conclusion. They make a distinction between, on the one hand, redistributive transfers, and on the other hand, investment in human capital, investment in transport infrastructure, etc. First, let's look at redistributive transfers. These are transfers which result from the income taxation system and which result from the social security system. And there, those theorists, they conclude, well, it does not do very much for regional convergence because there is less pressure on wages, and also because there are no incentives to commute. Commuting is also an important device in equalizing regions, because then the money that people earn in the rich regions is transferred to the poor regions where those commuters live. And they say, well, from a theoretical perspective, there is little or no regional convergence. Even worse, if we look to the economy as a whole, because the transfers are pushing up the tax burden artificially, it can even put downward pressure on the economic performance of the country as a whole. And therefore, in the theory literature, we find two alternatives. The first alternative, investment in transport infrastructure, but, is an important but, the models are contradicting themselves. And why are the models contradicting themselves? Well, if a region is really very weak, then an opening up of the region will just blow away those sectors who have stayed. So it will weaken further that region. On the other hand, when a region is not too weak, then the possibility to access other markets will strengthen that regional economy, and then it can be a way out of misery. The only thing that really works is investment in human capital, and human capital in the broad sense of the word, not only education, but also research and development, etc. This is a theoretical framework that we find in the literature, but we are still not convinced. We want to see empirical evidence. And there is a study being done at VIVES where we introduce 140 geographical units in 9 Eurozone countries. And those 9 Eurozone countries, they include the big ones. France is included, Italy is included, Spain is included, Germany is included, and a few smaller ones. Belgium is included. And if we analyze those various systems of interregional support, then we get the following results. Well, the theory is right. In other words, redistributive transfers are not helping the problem very much. And with those models, we can even go a step further. If we use those models on a European level, and we use the coefficients that come out of the model, and we apply them to the poorest Belgian province, Hainaut, then we do the following simulation exercise. Well, let's decrease the interregional transfers by 1/3, and then see what the model tells us as a prediction for future economic growth. And what do we see? Well, indeed, in the beginning of the process, there is a fall in disposable income, but after 6-7 years, there is a serious acceleration of economic growth, and we get beyond the level that we have under a system of under redistributive transfers. So in other words, in the end, Hainaut is better off without the transfers than with the transfers. But of course, for politicians, there is an annoying story. And what's the annoying story? 6-7 years is too much for a politician, because then he will lose the next election. Okay? So in other words, if you want to get into the history books, then you have to be prepared to lose an election. Mr. Schröder in Germany experienced that too. So we need courageous politicians. Third element, and I have to be careful with a specialist about Germany in the room, but nevertheless I give it a try. Another example is East Germany. East Germany originally was into the Belgian system, received massive interregional transfers, but what do we see? Nothing changes. So in other words, the misery only becomes bigger in relative terms, but then we have the Hartz reforms, but I just learned from Professor Zinn that Hartz is not really the mastermind of the whole system, but at least as a name it is known here in Belgium as. And what do we see with the Hartz reforms of 2003, 2005? Well, there is a reduction of the redistributive transfers. We see more labor market flexibility, and very important, we see larger regional wage differences. So in other words, we see that the labor market is able to do its job. Okay? And then we see a revival of economic growth during the last couple of years. But again, there is an important time lag. So don't expect miracles if we would copy that system one way or the other. And then there's a mysterious sentence, French-speaking economists in Belgium. Well, because there is a long road that they have traveled. In the 1970s and 1980s, when Flemish economists started investigating those interregional transfers, they just denied the whole thing. There are not transfers. There are only interpersonal transfers, but not regional transfers. And then they changed their mind. Well, there are transfers, but they are much smaller than the Flemish economists say. And later on, they again changed their mind. Well, those Flemish economists are not that bad. We more or less agree on the on the magnitude of those flows. But they say what those Flemish economists propose as a remedy is just rubbish. We don't believe it. And now, since the last couple of years, we see that they are moving in our direction. At least some of those economists are moving in our direction. So they are now pleading for more flexibility of wages. They understand that Wallonia can only get out of the trap if wages go down in relative terms. I'm not necessarily speaking about absolute terms. And why is it necessary that something happens in the near future? Well, because today Flanders faces its own challenges. As we all know, the aging problem is a little bit worse in Flanders than in Wallonia. We face a serious deindustrialization process. I know that some of my colleagues say that industry is not important, but I disagree. And if we compare it to the German situation, then we see that the deindustrialization process in Flanders is substantially faster than in Germany. We always were proud in Flanders about our labor productivity advantage, but if you look at the statistics, well, that advantage is eroding. So in other words, our competitive advantage, one of the pillars of our competitive advantage, is disappearing slowly but surely. High energy costs. And also worrying is, of course, again, if we compare with Germany, that the emerging economies, that we do not export enough to those emerging markets. So in other words, Flanders is not as powerful anymore in relative terms as far as a country or a region as Flanders can be powerful as it was, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago. So in other words, if we want to do something about these challenges, we need money. It will cost a lot of money, and that is not available anymore for the transfers. So in other words, we need a phasing out program. And the French-speaking economists, they are realizing this issue. So in other words, they understand that the transfers have to die out somehow, because otherwise it will stop suddenly one way or the other. Then I would like to say a word about the Belgian state reforms. So you know all that from the 1970s there has been a series of state reforms, but, and that's important to note here, they did not affect the interregional transfers very much, and that's logical because the social security system remained federal, and we installed all kinds of solidarity mechanisms between the regions, very similar to the Finanzausgleich in Germany. But the transfer issue is, in my view, only the top of the iceberg, because in my view, the Belgian federal structure as a whole is problematic. We are in a dangerous equilibrium, in an unstable equilibrium. Why? Well, because there are several construction flaws in our building. There is a famous vertical gap element, as economists call it, the mismatch between competences to spend, which are the regions and the communities, and the competences to tax, which is a federal issue. And that, of course, leads to all kinds of moral hazard problems. If you're only responsible for spending, well, this means that you will spend as much as you can, and that's what we observe in the regions and the communities. And the Spanish example even shows us that it can go beyond that, in the sense that you can borrow too much, get into financial difficulties, but you don't care too much, because in the end, the federal government will help you out. So there is a serious moral hazard problem here. But of course, if a bailout has to be organized, and there are some similarities with the European story, well, then there are important spillover effects. It will increase interest rates all over the country. So if one region comes into difficulties, then the whole country will face difficulties. These are criticisms which are often ventilated towards federal states in general, but in Belgium we like to make things even more complex. And how do we make things more complex? Well, because there is no hierarchy between the two levels. The federal level and the regions and the communities, they stand next to each other. There is no boss in the whole system. In Germany, this is different. In the end, it's the federal government who is the boss. And we have a second peculiarity, and that is that the retirement benefits of regional civil servants, in the broad sense of the word, so also including education and stuff like that, are paid for by the federal government. And this is a very strange thing. I mean, why would you not build up a huge bureaucracy, right? If a part of the bill is paid for by another level. And that's why we have in Belgium, or at least in Flanders, the feeling that the bureaucracy in Flanders is growing very rapidly. Well, I agree with that. We opened up the door for that by not putting the financial responsibilities where they should be. Last element, Austerity programs. Professor Zinn already talked about it. I include the aging problem. Well, this will put additional strain on the whole system. Why? Because the federal level has to pay the extra pensions, the extra retirement benefits. Another problem is, of course, that the grants to regions and communities are fixed by law, and you know in Belgium we need special laws to change them with special majorities, etc. So we know how to block things perfectly. And also we see that regions and communities are responsible for the growth-enhancing investments, infrastructure, education. So the regions and the communities can easily say, oh, but we don't want to have austerity policies because we want to pursue growth-enhancing policies, so don't bother us. Federal government, solve it yourself. Okay? So in other words, if we want to cope with austerity programs, if we will have to cope with the aging problem, well then of course we need a lot of cooperation between various governments in a context of regional parties. And this is an important difference with, for instance, Germany. In Germany there is a CSU, of course, in Bavaria, but in Flanders all parties are split between the two parts of the country. And to make things even more complicated, we have also asymmetric coalitions. In some regions, communities, you have center-right government coalitions. In other regions and communities, you have center-left coalitions, etc. So this is an interesting cocktail. And then the question is, of course, are they able to cooperate and are they able to get results? Well, I'm afraid that sooner or later, the thing will come to a standstill. We will end up in a stalemate position. So for those who believe that the 2011 agreement was the last state reform, I would say you ain't seen nothing yet. Thank you very much.